And these are our friends from New Zealand, because we've been holding our events at an impossible time for them. And now we have a special dedicated session, and I'm really pleased to see you. I'm pleased to see you at a time that's almost reasonable. I think it's, I don't know, what time in the morning is it? 6 or 7 or?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock was not so bad, you know, and really delighted to have you here. I hope, I mean, we've been going since 9 a.m. UK time, is now 6, so apologies for if tiredness shows and some people might need to go, but we're really delighted to have you. And I'm going to hand over now to Gary, who I think is going to start by giving us an overview of the situation, the COVID situation in long-term care in New Zealand, and then we're going to have presentations from from Jackie, Gary, and Doris on different cultural communities as well as on quarantine restrictions. Thank you very much. All yours, Gary.
Thank you, Adelina. Thank you for your introduction and putting aside an hour for New Zealand to present. Yes, it's 7 o'clock in the morning, and good morning and good evening to some of you, or good night. I watched the start of the conference. There was 10 p.m. here last night for about half an hour before I fell off to sleep. I thought I'd better get up early this morning. So I'll start with, we got 4 presentations. I'll start with an overview of the COVID situation in New Zealand. So I'll share screen. I'm an old age psychiatrist. I have a joint appointment with University of Auckland and the District Health Board here in Auckland. So can people see my slide okay? Seems okay.
Yes, I think you can project it maybe. Yes, perfect.
Okay, here we go. So this is the world map. If you don't know where New Zealand is, you turn the map upside down and you will see New Zealand's in the middle of the world. So at the moment, we're in this southern hemisphere, so we're the start of the summer. To give you some context, New Zealand is a small country. We're just over 5 million people. Well, similar size to Ireland. I heard our colleagues, Maria, just talk about the situation in Ireland. Because our presentation is going to be on, with a focus on ethnic groups. Just to tell you the 4 main ethnic groups in New Zealand. We have New Zealand Europeans, we have Maori, our indigenous people, Asians, and Pacific peoples. So Asians are people from mainly Chinese and Indian. So in New Zealand, Indian, the subcontinent of India is counted as part of Asia. And Pacific peoples, we have people from Tonga, the Pacific Islands, Tonga, Samoan, and Fiji Islands. So those are the main Pacific peoples living in New Zealand. The COVID situation, so all the data I'm presenting are from about a week ago, the end of November. We have 2 waves of COVID, of course, the start, and currently we have the Delta wave. And you can see that, well, looks like we have reached the peak. Well, I hope we have. The case number per day is kind of dropping. In terms of number of deaths, we have 44 deaths over this, the last 18 months or so. But I'll show you some data compared to the rest of the world. We are pretty fortunate, probably because of our location, being an island, so far away from the rest of the world. So compared to places, even Australia, our cousin across the ditch, we are having a lower rate of COVID infections per population. And this is the death rate. Again, we have a low death rate. We're pretty fortunate. Again, lower than other parts of the world. The blue line is the New Zealand rates there. Testing rates, we're doing not too bad, not as good as Israel, but according to this graph, we are 5th, the top 5 in terms of testing per 1,000 people population. In terms of cases, I've shown you the 4 main ethnic groups. There is a there are differences in terms of infection rate in different ethnic groups. So I showed you before the second largest population, Maori, actually more cases than New Zealand European. Asians have lower rate, and I'll come to talk about a bit more about that. And Pacific have quite a high rate for their population. In terms of the age group, tends to hit people in the 20s. Having said that, there is a little rise in the later age group as well, from about 70 on. Hospital rate, again, we're pretty fortunate. I think at the moment we have less than 10 people in ICU across the country and less than 100 cases currently in hospital. But these are the total numbers over the last 18 months or so. So that is a concern, because the government have put a lot of emphasis of not over-exhausting the health system. Vaccination number, we're doing not too bad. We were one of the lowest vaccination country amongst the OECD back in sort of April and May, but with Delta came to us in sort of mid-August, the government have driven a lot of vaccination rates. So the total, so 2 doses, around 86% now across the country, having 2 doses. And we use the Pfizer vaccine, but the AstraZeneca is also becoming available if people want to have booster. So I had my booster last Wednesday. And in terms of, I live in Auckland, and the health board here, the area we cover, we have 92% having 2 doses of vaccine. So it's pretty good. But looking back to the ethnic differences, again, there is a difference. Asian have very high rate very earlier on. All the Asians rush off to get their vaccines, hitting 2 doses, sort of 95% quite earlier on. But there's a disparities amongst our Maori, indigenous people, and Pacific people being lower. Having said that, there's a lot of work currently try to drive the rates up. In terms of aged care providers, our government have put, our Minister of Health have put in a lot of resources, and I'm not going to go through that, just want to show you there are a number of resources available for healthcare providers to use. For example, PPE use, screening, how to transfer between facilities, how to admit people from hospital to facilities. So there are a number of guidance documents there. Visiting, so specific visiting, we have 4 levels of, well, we've just changed a different alert level, but prior to last, we have 4 levels. So level 4 is the highest level, that's the lockdown. So for age residential care, there is no visiting from family. Level 3, that's compassionate, family can visit based on compassionate grounds. And as a clinicians, we can go, we are encouraged to see people online, but we can go in facilities if there is any urgent situation. And I have done that during the lockdown, being level 4 or level 3. In terms of ARC, so age residential care facilities, the cluster, this is the first wave. So this is back in March to May last year. There were a total of 5 facilities across the country. And I've highlighted those. I mean, the largest cluster was cluster 3. There was in the facility with 66 beds, and there was 19 cases there. So it's only 5, luckily it was 5 facilities. And Jackie, my colleagues, will talk about a facility she have done some research in later. So the government moved very quickly and did an independent review of the COVID clusters in aged residential facilities. So this document was released back in the end of May last year. Not going to go through all the recommendations, but I highlighted the two that what I thought was important, being a psychiatrist, identify number 4 and 5, identify as part of the recommendation, identify and provide psychosocial support for staff well-being during the COVID pandemic. Similarly, the recommendation 5 is about the residents' well-being, psychosocial support. So, and there are people interested that these are all available online. The second wave, this is what we currently, the second wave with the Delta. We have 2 facilities, and Doris and I got this number from searching the internet. I haven't seen any official release from the, it's probably hidden in one of the Ministry of Health website, but we look at all the news items last week, and there are 2 facilities. Both of them are in Auckland, and I forgot to say that the Delta wave mainly hit Auckland, but it's gradually spreading to the rest of the North Island. And that's mainly because Auckland is the largest city. And also we have most of the MIQ facilities here. So the border is really much here. So the 2 facilities, the first facility have 21 cases in residents, 2 deaths, 7 hospitalization, and 5 staff also have the cases. And that's interesting because this is in the last 3 months, and the 8 residential care facilities move very fast. Well, Jackie may confirm that they move very fast in terms of the vaccination, because I think in the middle, by middle of one of the first group to have vaccination as people in 8 residential care facilities, sort of back in May and June, I think, this year, they're pretty much vaccinated. So despite, I can't tell you, out of the 21 cases, whether they were, the proportion of people who are vaccinated, but I can imagine it's pretty high rate, probably 80s or in the 90s%. Facility 2 is a smaller facility, and there were 2 residents there, but no hospitalization, death, or and other staff. And as I said before, with the alert level 4, the lockdown, and alert level 3 a little bit down, this is the first retirement village chain in the Radius Care, and they also have residential care, so they have retirement village but also residential care. And this because they were concerned about the lack of visiting from family and the impact on that on their residents, the psychosocial health. So they're very brave. Instead, they're going to. This is over a month ago, end of October, allow visitors for residents' mental health. Actually, in my clinical work, I haven't been to the Radius Care facilities in the last 3-4 months. I have been to other 8 residential care facilities, and the one I've been to still have pretty vigilance in terms of visiting, so have to have full PPE for visiting residents. And non-urgent cases, we see them online. Yeah, that's a very quick overview of the situation in New Zealand and the 8 residential care setup. So should I carry on, Adelina?
Yes, please. Yeah, can you invite her? Yeah.
I'll invite my colleague Jackie. Good morning, Jackie, who's going to present her research in one
morning, Gary.
Good morning. I think you can share screen, and the floor is yours. Would you like to introduce yourself, Jackie?
I will. Just see if I can get this started. Right, everyone see that? Right. So Morena,
Jackie,
hi.
1 second, we can see it split. Do you want to see if you can?
Oh, right. Okay.
If not, don't worry.
I don't have any notes, but let me just see if I can.
But if you don't have embarrassing notes, we're happy. We're okay with it.
Only about Gary. Let me just out of this. No, I can't.
Don't worry,
Work it.
it's great. Don't worry.
Why it just keeps coming up like that. Sorry. Okay, so my name's Jackie Robinson. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Nursing at the University of Auckland. My background is in nursing. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I have, until very recently, been working in the same district health board as Gary in Auckland. I've now situated myself down in the South Island in Otaki, which is Christchurch. And I managed to get out of Auckland just before this most recent lockdown. So I sort of felt like the rat leaving the sinking ship, but nevertheless, I'm sure that COVID will find its way down here. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there for New Zealand. It sounds like you've had a very long, interesting day. So I know how tiring it can be sitting on Zoom all day, which is what we have to often do. I'm going to share with you a very small project that I did with very little funding that I managed to scrounge together from the university, and it came out of when I was working as a nurse practitioner. Can you see? Hold on, I think it's because I'm on two screens. Can you see the second slide?
Not properly. Don't know if you can click on.
Okay. I think it's because I've got too many screens open.
I mean, if you try with the,
Maybe do it from here.
yeah, do it from here. I think it's big enough. You just,
yeah, that might be easier. Sorry.
we don't see anything, Jackie, at the moment.
Okay.
Did you send it to us? We can also.
I
see
did. I did. I sent it to you too, Gary.
I'm on a different email. I'm on my clinical. Let's see. No, you did last night. Hang on.
Hold on, let me just see if I can get rid of these.
Jackie. Oh, yeah. Let's see.
Is that?
Yep. I think you can, yeah, if you carry on with the...
No. Maybe if I just do that.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it's just multiple screens. They don't like it, do they? So this project really came out of the fact that at the time last year when the first wave was occurring, I was working as a nurse practitioner in the surge response team. And this was one of the very first aged care facilities that we saw the virus get into. So the 27th of March, we went into lockdown and I was sitting at home over Easter thinking about Easter eggs and everything else, and got a call from my my leader, nursing leader at the District Health Board, saying there had been a case found in one of the aged care facilities that the District Health Board were responsible for, and all the team had to stand down. And so it was very difficult to say that I was too busy because we were all in lockdown and we were all working from home and restricted to our home. So I went whizzing into the hospital, got a whole lot of PPE, and with another colleague, we went into the facility. One of the things that I observed was that having gone in with all the usual care staff leaving because they all had to stand down and be tested, that the residents were left in this care facility with a whole lot of new staff coming in, including myself. Many had cognitive impairment, didn't understand what was happening, and it was very difficult for us to explain what was happening because we were in full PPE and masks and things. So communication was difficult. We were given a list of screening questions to screen all the residents, which weren't always helpful with people with chronic conditions because many of the screening questions were answered positively but didn't necessarily mean that we needed to swab them. Obviously, family hadn't been in for several weeks prior to this, and usual care staff had been stood down, so nobody familiar was in the facility. The other thing that I noticed during the period of time that we were responding was that there was no time to discuss transfer to hospital as a choice for residents. And some of these residents were very frail and were nearing the end of their life. But it was essentially, once we thought was suspicious of them having COVID or tested positive, they were bundled up into an ambulance and sent to the main hospital. Mainly, I think, as a protection for other residents, but there was just not time for any conversations about choice, which, coming from a palliative care background, I found quite distressing at the time. So what we knew around the rest of the world at that time was that there was devastation in many aged care facilities around the world, and we thought we were going to end up in the same position. As I said, visitors had been prohibited for several weeks, and Gary's talked a little bit about that. But the thing that I did notice at this point was that not only were residents restricted with visitors, the restrictions were tightening as we needed to institute droplet precautions. So we talked about this quarantine. So residents were restricted to their rooms, staff were told to limit contact with residents, and of course they hadn't had visitors for a long period of time, and I wondered about the impact of that on people's well-being. So after the initial crisis had begun to resolve, I went to my head of school and asked for a tiny little bit of money because I just felt really passionate about doing some work and finding out what had actually gone on for this facility. So it was a concurrent exploratory two-phase mixed method study. As I said, it was in one aged care facility who had experienced a sudden 3-week period of quarantine. I used inter-eye data from the long-term care facility assessments. I worked with Bridget Meehan, who is one of the leads for our inter-eye centre, and we together chose which variables we would look at that we thought at the time would reflect overall health and well-being. So looked specifically at cognition, physical function, mood, and psychosocial variables. I pulled assessment data from the most recent, around the 25th of March when we first went into lockdown, and then assessments after the 8th of June, which is when we started to reduce restrictions and go back to what then was known as level 1. We expected to see quite a lot of gaps in the assessments, and because assessments with surge staff were put on hold, but in fact we had a pretty thorough, a pretty robust data set. So there were 75 residents at this facility, nothing surprising in terms of characteristics. Most were aged over 76. Most were New Zealand European, which is not unusual in New Zealand. Very few Indigenous or Pacific people end up in aged residential care, the majority are New Zealand European. And in terms of diagnosis, a reasonable number had dementia, but of course that was a primary diagnosis of dementia. There would have been quite a few residents who had some cognitive impairment without a primary diagnosis of dementia. I did some t-test pairwise analysis of the pre and post assessments. What I found was that there was no significant change in scores related to cognition or mood, which surprised me quite a lot. And there's a lot of evidence around the impact of isolation on cognition, but certainly there was no change in the scores from pre and post quarantine period. What we did see is a negative impact on the psychosocial scores, particularly around social relationships, which isn't surprising given the fact that people were pretty restricted with having any contact with anybody. There's also a section in the inter-eye assessment around what's referred to as strengths, and these three points are what people have to score on, which is maintaining strong relationships with family or whānau, having a consistent positive outlook on life and finding meaning in day-to-day life, and that had a negative impact. So the lower the score, the worse the psychosocial status was for these residents. There's also found to be a negative impact on locomotion scores and walking. And certainly we were getting some anecdotal stories around the fact that because family weren't able to go in and help keep residents mobile, and people were being restricted to their rooms there, they didn't walk as much as they normally would. One of the interesting findings, and I ran this test several times because I couldn't quite believe it, was that the activities of daily living self-functioning scores actually improved. And I wondered if this was because people were left to get on and care for themselves quite a lot. And so they were asked to look after themselves. That scoring is in reverse. So the lower the score, the better the self-functioning score. So in phase 2, being a good qualitative interviewer, I'm really interested in people's stories, and I was able to get a research assistant to help me with some interviews, which were all done by telephone because we were still going in and out of lockdowns. So what I did was put invitations out to residential care staff who they had to be eligible, they had to be working prior to and during first or second lockdown. Next of kin, as recorded in clinical notes, they were posted and emailed an invitation. And staff helped me identify residents who might be keen to be interviewed. We're still analysing some of the data. We had a total of 14 interviews, 4 from staff, 5 from family or whānau, and 5 from residents. The questioning was really around, specifically around what people's opinions were around the impact of quarantine and isolation on the residents. Asked in different ways, but essentially wanting to know how they felt those restrictions impacted on them. Some of the things that came out of the interviews was that for some residents, being restricted to their rooms was a reflection of their normality. So it was something that they did even prior to lockdown, which worried me somewhat. But for some residents, spending most of the time in their rooms was what they would normally do. So the fact that they were restricted to their rooms didn't really make any difference to them. And this particular resident said that they didn't really miss anything, didn't make any difference, except when the girls came in, and he was referring to the new staff that had came in, and sort of one lot coming in, the other leaving, and then a new lot coming in and out. But he didn't really miss anything because he didn't normally get any visitors, so it didn't make any difference to him. One of the things that came out with the family interviews was that family, when they realised that they were going to be restricted even further, was having this panic, if you like, to stay connected with family before they weren't allowed to have any contact at all. And this lady was the wife of a resident who had quite severe cognitive impairment, and her concern was that she would be forgotten. And she knew that by explaining to him and coming in and explaining to him at that moment, he would understand, but that as soon as she left or soon after, he would forget. And her concern was that nobody was going to keep reminding him why she wasn't visiting and that he would just forget about her. And in fact, when she came back in, finally, when lockdown restrictions loosened, he said to her, I didn't think I was ever going to see you again. And that was what he had resigned himself to. So some of the residents talked a little bit about social connection and trying to maintain that with their residential, with other residents. And this chat talked about sneaking out at night, which I thought was quite funny. So he used to sneak out the back door and go up to the local petrol station. But he was always safe. He would always take all the right precautions, and staying safe was something that came through all the interviews. And I think what this came out from me was that, you know, we talk about this population being vulnerable, and yet some of them were making their own choices. And I'm sure there are people not in aged care that sneaked out and kept themselves safe in the meantime. And this chap certainly did that. The staff interviews I'm still looking at, so I'm just giving you a little snippet really, having listened to a few of them last night, was that there was a lot of talk around staying safe as a family, and the staff said that although residents found it difficult, they wanted to keep each other safe. So they just had this pragmatic approach of, well, we'll just do what we have to do and we'll just get on with it. So that sort of really pragmatism came through quite a lot. The thing that they did say that was restricting residents to their room, they found extremely challenging. But again, most residents just did what they had to do. And so they did that. The staff used technology a lot to try and maintain connection. And what they did notice was during restrictions that the number of letters and cards coming in increased substantially as family were trying to stay connected. The one thing that they did notice, although they didn't notice at the time that residents' mood was deteriorating, what they did notice was when the usual care staff came back, there was this feeling of celebration and feeling of uplifting of mood when the usual care staff came back. So they didn't notice at the time, but they noticed it when usual care staff started coming back. One of the things that was really interesting thinking back to it is because it was such a new experience for us in New Zealand, and we'd seen what was happening internationally, there was a huge surge response. We only had, as Gary had pointed out, 3 facilities in Auckland that were experiencing COVID, but we were predicting that we were going to have the same mortality rates as everybody else in the world was experiencing, particularly some terrible stories coming from the US and from Europe. And so our surge response was really rapid. And one of the things that came out in the interviews from some of the usual care staff was that actually there were just too many people. The surge team was huge, and in fact there was just too many staff, which made the communication more difficult. It made it more confusing for residents, and that if they'd had just a few less people coming in. So you got to remember there was household staff that had to be replaced, care home staff, admin staff, everybody was new. And I think we probably just overdid it a little bit looking back. So just to summarise and to give a little punt to the TRI Palliative and End of Life Research Group, which is what I'm a member in, although this wasn't necessarily a focus of it on end of life care. I wanted to just give our group a punt. Our website is here, my Twitter handle's there if you'd like to follow some of the work that we do. But in summary, from this small project was that the restrictions did impact negatively on some physical, not all, but some physical and certainly some psychosocial factors, but that mood and cognitive state remained unchanged. For some people, being isolated in their rooms was their normal activity, so they didn't find it as challenging or as distressing as I had thought that they would. That family worked very, very hard to stay connected, and their distress was around concerns about being forgotten. But there was a sense, really overwhelmingly, that residents just got on and did what they had to do to keep themselves and others safe, and that the usual care home staff were missed by residents, and that did impact on their emotional well-being at the time. So that was that in a nutshell. Thank you very much for listening. I know you're all probably ready to go to bed. We're ready to start our day. Kia ora. Thank you. Thanks, Gary.
You. And I am smiling. I couldn't resist putting it in the chat. This is the first time I hear of anyone having too much stuff. I mean, if the rest of the day we've heard some very, very different stories, and I mean, it's become clear from the beginning that the countries that did well at keeping COVID out also did well within the care homes. And of course, you had negative impacts from the confinements, but it really is quite something to read such a different experience, and how the learning, I think, from what was happening in other countries clearly was taken in and put in place. So that's a very general comment from me, but I just couldn't resist it. I saw Francisca Laporte also noticed that. Anyone has, sorry, Gary, I just jumped in. I think you were kind of going to moderate. Anyone has any questions for Jackie? Any comments?
Noticed in the comments there are a few people who said they can't believe there was too much staff, and I think it's really we've just had a very different situation. I mean, you've seen the death rates, you've seen the mortality rates, you've seen the incidents. We've taken a very our lockdowns have been incredibly restrictive. Right from the very first go, our lockdown level 4 essentially meant everyone had to stay at home. We've had motorways, which are normally congested, just absolutely empty for several weeks at a time when we went into level 4. I think we've had the most restrictive lockdowns in the world. We are now having some critique about that politically. But in fact, our economy has survived and our healthcare system has survived. There's more pressure now to not go into those lockdowns. We can't keep doing it. It's not sustainable. But we had to do it to save our healthcare system, because we don't have, Gary can comment on this, but we don't have, we have a great healthcare system, but things like our number of ICU beds per 100,000 is the lowest, one of the lowest in the world. So we just couldn't afford not to do that at the time. And it saved a lot of lives, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Any other questions for Jackie? If not, we go to Gary. I think it's Gary first and then Doris, is that right?
Okay. So my presentation is on looking at the first wave of the COVID, so the first 3 months from March 2020, particularly looking at the health and psychosocial well-being of Maori Pacific peoples and using New Zealand Europeans as a comparison group living in aged residential care. Jackie mentioned the Interine assessment, and I'm not sure in the audience whether you're familiar with Interine. Some of you are, some of you may not be familiar with it. So Interine is a comprehensive assessment with 250 clinical and psychosocial variables. So great for researchers. And New Zealand is probably one of the few countries in the world that Interine is mandated for every single residence in care. So every residence have a Interine assessment completed every 6 months. So there are a lot of data sitting with our Ministry of Health and create an excellent opportunities for researchers. So I take advantage of that opportunity and look at the Interine assessment of people in the first wave of COVID here, and compare to people who had the inter-arm assessment a year earlier. So these are my co-authors. I want to acknowledge we have Matalolia Linton. He's a Maori primary care physician, and also a senior lecturer in the University of Auckland, helping with the interpretation of the Maori data. Itu Mao is an old-age psychiatrist at the University of Auckland. He's a Tongan old-age psychiatrist. And Xavier Walker is a Tongan geriatrician in Dunedin in the South Island, not far from Jackie, at University of Auckland. So both Itu and Xavier provided support in terms of interpretation of the data related to Pacific peoples. So this research just got published last week. So I'm just, yeah, the final version was released last week. So we all know, I'm not going to go through all the literature on aged residential care, but we know that residents are often emotionally distressed, and you've heard Jackie's presentation. They feel disconnected and socially isolated during the lockdown. I want to tell you a little bit about the two holistic models of health for Maori and Pacific peoples. So family relations are particularly important in determining the health and well-being of our Maori and Pacific peoples. And that these are the two well-recognized and well-used holistic models of health. In Maori, we have the Te Whare Tapawha, and you can see the marae on the left here, as there are 4 aspects to the person's health. So the well-being in the middle, the haora. But family is there. Tana whanau. Whanau is family. But we also have taha hinianro, so that's mental and emotional health. Taha warua, that's the spiritual health. And also lastly, the taha tinana, that's the physical health of the person, all important in terms of the health determinants of Maori. Similarly, in Pacific people, we have the Whanawhale model, and you can see family down in the bottom. That's the building block for your health. So based on that, those two health models, we hypothesized that strict isolation and restricted family visiting could have a negative effect on the health and so the psychosocial well-being of Maori and Pacific people, more so for them, we thought, than New Zealand European, because of the importance of family. So we look at the first national lockdown of the 3 ethnic groups. So just to remind ourselves, 21st of March is when we have the alert level 2. But so aged care facilities starting to lock, they're ahead of the national lockdown actually. They have their own system and went ahead and locked down their facilities. So on the 21st of March. And gradually we, over the 3 months period, we moved from alert level 4 back to level 1, 8th of June. So the research here is, the research covered the 25th of March to the 8th of June. So I've told you that inter-arm assessment is mandatory. So we look at that 3 months period. We compare the assessment of the same ethnicities during the same period in the previous year. So we compare Maori who had inter-arm assessment during the first lockdown with Maori who had inter-arm assessment in the 3 months period in 2019. And like Jackie, we choose a number of indicators, and that was quite a discussion amongst the research team because there are so many variables we can choose. And what I'm going to show you looks a little bit different from what Jackie has shown. well, not a lot, but certainly we cover mood and cognition. We didn't cover the psychosocial relations as such. What can be done? Just to show you the inter-IN assessment, although it's mandatory, during the 3 months period, there was a reduction of the number of inter-IN assessment done initially. And I think that's because staff were very busy putting protections and restrictions in place. So the orange line is the 2020 number of assessment, and compared to 2019. So the first month, that's when we had the hardest lockdown, the level 4 lockdown, with lower number of inter-IN assessment. And this is a very busy slide, but just want to show you, we got, this covered the whole of the country. Well, we had 35,000 residents in aged residential care residents in New Zealand. Of course, not every single person from that 35,000 had an inter-IN assessment done within that 3 months period. So the numbers showing here are lower because some of the residents may just have their inter-IN assessment done, say, in January 2020, and they won't be due for another one in July 2020. But it's a very good number here. We have just over 500 Maori, just over 200 Pacific peoples, and a lot more New Zealand Europeans. So we compare within their own ethnicity. So, but you can see that the age, sex, and marital status are pretty similar compared, the 2 periods amongst all 3 groups. We look at the self-rated health. We look at the functionality. We look at falls. We look at their cognitive performance as well, but we couldn't find any statistically significant changes over that over the period of the lockdown. We did find some significant results in depression rating scales, more depression, but that's only shown up in New Zealand Europeans. And that could be because we have slightly smaller sample size in Pacific and Maori, may not have able to detect that significant change, but certainly there's more depression in New Zealand European. No change in loneliness. In fact, for Maori, I forgot to put a red color rectangle there. For Maori, there's less loneliness during lockdown. And that was the unexpected finding, a positive finding. And good to hear Jackie's result. She also found some positive findings. The other positive findings is hospitalization, less number of hospitalization. And that's not unexpected for two main reasons, because people were told not to go to the hospital during lockdown. And the second reason was there was lower rates of other infectious diseases, for example, influenza, because people are adhering to strict sort of hygienes and so on, and infections control. So we found no immediate negative effect other than depression in New Zealand Europeans during the first wave of COVID. And we've already told you New Zealand, for the first wave anyway, have the lowest case numbers, incidence and mortality in the world. And that's because of our rapid escalation of national suppression strategies. And there's other studies showing that there's also a reduction of influenza and other respiratory viral infections. And that could perhaps lead to better health status and may explain the reduction in the hospitalization amongst Maori and New Zealand Europeans. And what about other New Zealand COVID literature? There are some. So my colleagues, Susanna and Everett Palmer, University of Otago, they did a survey in April, and they found, compared to pre-pandemic National Health Survey, there was an increased level of psychosocial distress for 18 to 19 years age group. There was another study that was conducted in, I think, in June 2020 by colleagues in our department. Our health psychologist found that older adults, the 65 to 74, have significant higher depressive symptoms compared to pre-pandemic normative data. But they didn't find increase in depression in the 75 plus group, and that was interesting. And I think a lot of literature coming out now saying the older people may be more resilient than the younger folks. And there was a lovely qualitative done in Dunedin. So during the first lockdown, this care facility for people with dementia, the staff stayed in the facility and they lived with the residents. And that was amazing. And they did some qualitative research, and they found, during the lockdown, with that move of staff live in, they have an increase in their interactions, they have reduction in falls, they have improved mood as well. And our colleagues in the University of Otago also found that because of the social and community cohesiveness, there's some silver lining to the first lockdown. Not sure about the second lockdown. We have to do a bit more research now. Limitations, number limitation I need to acknowledge. So we have 2 separate cross-sectional samples over those 2 years period. There are some residents appeared in both time periods. We didn't use within subject design. We could have, but because of just under half of the people have the diagnosis of dementia, we thought that's not, we could see a change, natural change of natural progression of dementia, of deterioration in like cognition or the functioning. So we didn't do that. And I've told you not every New Zealand ARC resident was included in those 2 study period. The sample size of Maori and Pacific people were much smaller. And we didn't include Asians. And I have to confess, being Chinese, I didn't investigate that. That's all right. Doris is doing her study in Chinese, and she's going to present that shortly. And I'll show you earlier on that Asians is the 3rd largest ethnic group. We didn't do investigations because the grant was specifically for Maori and Pacific people. It can be done, and we will do it because we would like to look at the second lockdown data. So if anyone wants to collaborate, email me. It's quite interesting looking at our interim data. And of course, the first month after lockdown, there was high workload for our staff working in aged residential care. There was stress, and that may impact the quality of the interim assessment. Imagine, if you have full PPE, if your mask on, and you have to do an interim assessment, usually take at least 1.5 to 2 hours. So conclusion, we found a lower rate of loneliness in Maori, but a higher rate of depression in New Zealand European. We really don't know why loneliness, the rate is lower in Maori, so we will need some more study, particular qualitative studies, looking at these differences amongst different ethnic communities. Of course, the second wave we need to investigate. And we'll do that next year because we're still in the middle of the second wave. Once we've gone back to normal, we can request data quite easily and look at the same variables. So these are the lovely people who helped us. The Interim New Zealand, the Technical Advisory Services, providing us with the lovely data. Nicolau Minko helped me with the residential care numbers, the residence numbers, and funding from Brain Research New Zealand, the COVID-19 short-term project. And that's my email address, so please do email me if you're interested in using interim data in your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. That's fascinating and just so interesting. Any questions for Gary? Comments also from the people, the colleagues from New Zealand as well. And I mean, from my side, I just keep being stuck into what the different experience you'd have, and also how interesting to see these differences between the different ethnic groups. And we don't really see that much of these type of studies. And I see there's a question from Francisca. Francisca, go ahead.
Hi, Gary, and hi, colleagues from New Zealand. Lovely to see you this way. Just a very brief one. Of course, I'm fascinated, as you know, because we are embarking on some research together. But that's not my question. I'm wondering if you could describe for me and probably the wider audience, what it means for residents under the level 4 lockdown. What does it look like in a residential care home? Do residents actually stay more or less confined to their own rooms, or by swapping entire teams, does it allow for some normal interaction within the homes?
Yeah, so different facilities have slightly different rules. So for example, I can think of one facility I visited last week, and they have, I don't know how many beds there are, probably 50 to 60. There are 2 bubbles. So within each of the bubbles, the residents interact amongst themselves. They still have very limited visiting. Family can visit, but under a what do you call it? And at the front of the building, they're not allowed to go in still. Yeah, so it's different. But people, staff, and facilities are well aware of the psychosocial impact. So they try to create more activities within the home, even though residents are not allowed to leave. And I have another patient. And he's in a rest home. And again, he's not allowed to leave the property. So what did I do? I said, come to my clinic every week. I'll see you every week. At least you can get out. So we try to be creative. I don't know, I haven't told my manager, but because he doesn't need to be seen every week. But I said, at least you come to our clinic for half an hour. I can,
Gary, we're recording this. Be careful. We can cut this bit if you wish.
No, we have good reason. I can justify that. So we have to, people are being creative. And I told you, the rest home in Dunedin, the staff moved in and lived there. And again, that's the creativity staff have. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think we'll now hear about the Chinese people living in care homes. We're going to hear people from Chinese origin. We're going to hear from, let me just get the right bit of paper. I think it's the end of the day and the brain. So we're going to hear from Doris Zhang on the impact of COVID lockdowns on Chinese care homes in New Zealand. Thank you so much, Doris.
Thank you, Adelina. I'll just quickly share my screen. Hopefully it'll work.
Perfect. Yes. Sometimes
can you all see that fine?
Yes, we see. Oh, good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for sticking to the end. And good morning to Gary, Jackie, and Sarah. My name is Doris Zhang. I'm a medical student at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And my project is on the impact of COVID-19 lockdown on Chinese care home residents in New Zealand. So care home residents are a vulnerable group of individuals, and I'm sure that all of us here know that. Factors such as pre-existing cognitive impairment, physical impairments, and a predisposition to loneliness were all contributors to them being overrepresented in COVID-19 related statistics. However, Chinese care home residents in New Zealand face additional barriers, including language and cultural differences, but also a surge in COVID-19 related discriminatory behaviours since the start of the pandemic. There's also been a lack of Chinese voices in the New Zealand qualitative literature, so there's a need for further research in this field. And that's why my aim for this project was to explore the experiences of Chinese care home residents in New Zealand during the COVID-19 lockdowns. So Our study took place in Auckland, New Zealand, and I think you've heard a bit about that from Gary and Jackie. So it's known as the City of Cells and is home to actually 1/3 of New Zealand's entire population. But most notably, it's also home to about 2/3 of all Asian peoples in New Zealand. So there's quite a lot of Chinese people there, including me and Gary. So in Auckland, we included 2 Chinese-run care homes, Care Home A, which was a dementia care unit with mostly non-Chinese residents, and then Care Home B, which was a rest home, hospital-level care home with mostly Chinese residents. I conducted face-to-face interviews with 6 residents, 6 family members, and 6 staff, so 18 in total. And these interviews were either in English or Mandarin Chinese, according to what the participants preferred. They were recorded, transcribed, coded, and then thematic analysis was performed. So here's a timeline to give some context as to when my interviews were conducted. As you've heard, and as you can see, we've been through quite a few cycles of lockdown within Auckland, New Zealand. But I managed to capture their experiences earlier this year during Alert Level 1, which is the lowest alert level that allowed me to visit the facilities in person. So it was nice that I could talk to the residents face to face. I had quite a diverse group of participants in terms of age, but also length of time they'd spent in the care home and also New Zealand. 15 interviews were in Mandarin Chinese, so majority, and 3 were in English. All participants identified as being Chinese except for 1 staff member from Care Home A, and most of the participants were also originally from mainland China as opposed to maybe Taiwan or Malaysia. Because Care Home A was a dementia care unit, most residents tended to be more severely cognitively impaired, so most interviews were conducted in Care Home B. We synthesized 3 themes from the data as shown on the screen, the first one being lockdowns as seen through a Chinese lens, and then specific needs and considerations for Chinese care home residents during lockdown, and the final one being navigating technology during COVID-19 as a Chinese care home resident. We then synthesized several sub-themes underneath each theme, which you'll see in this big diagram on the next slide. But because we are short on time, I'll only talk about the first and third theme in detail. I'll start with theme 1, talking about Chinese culture, which will be an introduction to the unique Chinese context to our study, and I'll focus on the 2 sub-themes indicated on the slide. The first one being challenges to the fulfillment of filial duties, and the second one being acceptance of the inevitable. And then I will move on to the third theme, which focuses on technology and mainly talk about the use of group chats in a social media application called Wechat. So first and foremost, I'll start with a crash course on Confucian philosophy. So Chinese culture is heavily shaped by Confucian philosophy, and broadly speaking, it's characterized by societal rules and moral obligations. It proposes that social harmony is of utmost importance in achieving peace within a collective human society. And as such, individuals hold very specific positions within a social hierarchy and are expected to fulfill certain duties within those roles. And one such example of a duty is Filal piety, which is defined as a virtue, where an individual respects one's parents, elders, and ancestors as well. And it's thought to stem from the agrarian nature of Chinese society, where elders were seen as a source of wisdom. And so age was seen as this determinant of authority within communities. Older figures were therefore meant to be respected and obeyed by the younger ones. So Filal piety has been seen also as a form of reciprocation for sacrifices made by parents during child rearing. During lockdown though, the ability of children to fulfill these Filal duties was disrupted because of the visiting restrictions. So this segues to the sub-theme 1 of our first theme, which is challenges to the fulfillment of Filal duties. One resident said, "I understand, I really do. I can't blame my children, can't blame them for not fulfilling their filial obligations, though it's true that in Chinese culture, it is an expectation." So we can see that this resident was fully aware that lockdown had prevented their children from fulfilling their filial obligations, such as visiting them or bringing them food. But these residents also showed this understanding and stoic acceptance of why it must happen, most participants understood that the pandemic was this unprecedented circumstance, and therefore they were able to rationalize the situation and adjust their expectations accordingly. The staff member said, in the latter half of lockdown, some family members would leave food at the entrance every day. Staff would go pick it up, and when the residents ate those homemade meals, the appetite improved. And this quote highlights how participants were able to adapt their traditional methods of fulfilling those Filal expectations to the pandemic context. But it also raises the symbolic significance of food within Chinese culture. The role of food extends beyond a simple means of sustenance to being a symbol of respect, affection, and love within the Chinese community. And Chinese food, being Chinese in origin, connected residents to their broader cultural identity and reminded them of their family who were thinking of them outside of those care home walls. And there was comfort, I think, for the residents to think that they were eating some familiar flavors made by familiar hands. The concept of Filal party heavily influenced our participants' experience of lockdown and also was key to maintaining connections within these Chinese families in our study. And the literature actually shows that overseas, low receptive Filal party is actually associated with increased suicidal ideation among the elderly. But our quotes also reflect how Filal party has been evolving under different socio-political contexts. So among Chinese older adults, these expectations have become more flexible over the years. And traditionally, Filal party was fulfilled through more practical means, such as children providing financial support for their parents. But there's been a general trend towards acts of affection instead, such as providing home-cooked meals, like in our study. And these views will likely continue to adapt and evolve in the future. And the study just provides a very brief glimpse into the complexity of the interactions between Chinese culture and the experience of lockdown. So I would like to talk also about the second sub-theme, which is acceptance of the inevitable. And this will also be an opportunity to introduce two Chinese idioms shared by our participants. So it'll be a mini Chinese lesson. One resident said when asked about the impact of lockdown, the emotional impact of things, what impact? Just 任天由命. If you get infected, then it can't be helped. But if you don't go out, then you won't get infected. So I just don't go anywhere. So 任天由命 is a Chinese idiom meaning to accept whatever comes or to accept the inevitable. Though initially it may sound like or imply feelings of pure resignation and hopelessness, this idiom actually reflects a pragmatic attitude where the residents focused on what was in their control rather than what was out of their control, i.e. the pandemic as a whole. And this attitude was further reflected by a quote from a family member that goes like this: how should I say this? As Chinese, usually, 未雨绸缪. If we know there will be some challenge in the near future, then we'll prepare and buy whatever we need beforehand. So 未雨绸缪 means to wrap your house in silk before the rain. This idiom specifically references the typical and pragmatic Chinese attitude of being extra cautious and preparing early for the worst case scenario, and to take action rather than linger in thought. So the Chinese proverb I introduced before, 任天由命, meaning to accept whatever comes, actually originates from a famous Confucian proverb that goes, 生死有命, 富贵由天, which means life and death are determined by fate, but wealth and prosperity are determined by the heavens. And it's a common Chinese approach towards facing hardships in life. Rather than focusing on the inevitable or uncontrollable, which only the heavens can decide, individuals are urged to find peace through setting their sights on what they can do within their own position in society. There was a sense that all participants felt a loss of control during the pandemic restrictions, but many reached a sense of peace through this mentality. And this perspective is quite distinctively Chinese in nature and also presents a contrast between Chinese and Western values. This attitude has also been observed among Chinese older adults in the United States as well. So it's not just in New Zealand. Finally, I'd like to move on to the third theme and talk about the use of group chats in a Chinese social media application that you may have heard of, called Wechat. So Wechat is a multi-purpose application that, along with a host of other functions, lets you direct message, voice call, and video call. So it's quite similar to a lot of other social media applications that we're all familiar with. Both Care Home A and B utilize WeChats to form group chats, which would include staff, family members, and also sometimes residents. Care Home A had smaller group chats within different family units, whereas Care Home B had this overarching group chat that included the whole care home community. Here are some quotes. The staff member said, "They're all in one group. WeChat is very good to connect all of them, and they are very free to ask questions there. If they have any concerns, they just put it there. It's very open. It's transparent." And a resident said, "They updated the chat every time the situation changed, so everyone with a mobile phone can see what we should do." As you can see in these quotes, WeChat allowed a fostering of an online care home community, where family members, whether they were in New Zealand or overseas, were able to spontaneously ask questions, raise concerns, or see snapshots of the daily lives of their loved ones during lockdown. Care home staff also made announcements, including changes in regulations, according to alert level changes through this group chat. This is analogous to our own government's 1 p.m. press conferences that were held consistently every day, or even village announcements or loudspeakers in more rural Chinese communities overseas. They're all ways to bond the community. So WeChat served as a vehicle to enhance the relationship between residents, family members, and staff. Not only were staff able to consistently update family members and residents, but there was a sense of shared experience and knowledge, and this strengthened the connections between members of the community. Transparency between members of the group chat also helped to facilitate online discussion, and we noticed that residents were also participating actively in that discussion. You can see this especially in this quote. "The care home is very good. They took photos of residents every day, them eating, doing activities, and posted it into the group chat so all the family can see. So we were put at ease. We've been here for more than 2 years, so I understand them. We're basically a big family." The group chat reinforced this family members' trust and sense of connection to the overall care home community. Furthermore, as a Chinese application, WeChat also served to connect our participants to the broader international Chinese community. So our results indicate that WeChat was an example of how an information and communication technology was able to both enhance communication and maintain relationships between residents, family members, and staff during times of isolation. Literature also suggests that the use of technology during mid to late life can actually help to reduce cognitive decline during the normal process of aging. However, some individuals, such as those with cognitive impairment or physical impairments, may struggle to use this technology. We can overcome this by asking for staff to provide extra help, but that also places further burden on already stressed care home staff. So it's essential that decision makers in the long-term care sector support these care homes by ensuring that they're equipped with the essential technological infrastructure, but also that there's training available. In terms of strengths of my study, I was lucky enough to conduct these interviews in person and also in the participants' preferred language, so they were able to express themselves relatively freely. And as a Chinese New Zealander, I was able to connect with them on a more fundamental cultural level and offer a unique perspective during the interpretation of the data. I was involved in all stages of the study, so I could ensure that the overall themes were reflective of the experiences of my participants. And these themes were robust because they were triangulated across 3 separate participant groups. In the future, I would try to include other non-mainland Chinese participants to better represent the overall diverse Chinese New Zealand demographic, and also maybe better delineate between whether experiences were directly associated with lockdown or whether they were there beforehand. And as Gary said, the second lockdown raises the possibility of replicating a study and seeing if results differ. So the pandemic has and is still presenting many challenges to us all, but I think it's also an opportunity to reflect and improve on current practices. I hope that the experiences of these Chinese elderly that I've shared has served to be a celebration of what enormous hope and strength can be found through human connection, but also how we can enhance this in the future. I'd like to end with this quote from a participant. "During lockdown, suddenly I felt much closer to the relatives of residents. I felt like we were a sort of family. I believe that the triumphs in their stories also resonate within our narratives. Thank you, everyone, and please take care." thank you also to all my supervisors, to Jackie, to Gary, Sarah, and also to everyone involved in the study.
Wow, thank you so much. I mean, if I had known that this was going to be it, I would also have put you at the end of the day to send us all, you know, home and to relax, happy, cheerful, and I can't say just with the heart really touched. This is a lovely, lovely study. Thank you very much. And I almost feel like I'm a master chef judge now, but excuse me, because it's the end of a long day. It's been a grim day in many parts, in what we've heard from other parts of the world and other parts, not just in Europe, has been very different. And it's also such a beautifully conducted study, and you've put it, yeah, well, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And any other comments, any questions for Doris, me? I think but I'd love to hear more about your next part of the studies, and I really also think that you're a fantastic presenter. That was really superb. I mean, not that Gary and Jackie and everyone before weren't good, obviously, but I thought that was a very special presentation and a perfect way to end the day. And please keep us updated with your work. Just to plug, so we, in the earlier part of the day, and maybe you were actually there last night for you, we were showing this and so this living report on long-term care and COVID, and we'd love to hear more there and have more about the New Zealand experience. I do think that it's really important that other countries learn from it. I know that New Zealand is very special in lots of ways, but I do think it's extremely important to see the power of learning and how sometimes countries can learn from the others and avoid making the same mistakes, and how then the differences that has in the experiences of the people who are experiencing lockdowns. So thank you. Any final comments, thoughts, or just a big thank you? Thanks for all of you who stayed for so many hours. I see some of you haven't, kept the camera on all day as well, particularly Maria and Lourdes. And thanks also Daisy, Charnel, my colleague Angie. I see David, quite a few of my CPEC colleagues as well who've been here all day supporting, making all these run smoothly. Thank you, Daisy and Angie, Charnel for being behind and making everything run smoothly, tweeting, sharing screens and everything we did. So we'll see many of you tomorrow. Have a good trip, Sarah. And yeah, I'm sorry tomorrow is not very friendly for you in New Zealand, but we will do videos. Have a good evening, good day, and see you soon. Bye. Wow, and many, I mean, I did wonder whether some people were not actually there, but I see some coming through as well. Bye, bye everyone.